Alaikum Allah. I apologize for the quality of some of the sound with the source Pani. This is, of course, one of the pitfalls of doing things online like this, that sometimes the sound and the video can be hostage to the quality of our connection. But I would certainly commend the effort and the devotion shown by our source fans this evening, and I hope that that intention has reached you all. We will now move to our main address, and today we will be hearing from Sayyid Hadi Qazwini from California, who will be interpreting the theme as he sees fit. And so I will now pass over to Sayyid Hadi.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to first express my gratitude to Dr. Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi, to Sheikh Kumail Rajani, to Brother Mustafa Abdi, and everyone who worked together to organize this series. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. It's an honor for me to join and to participate in the commemorations of Abi Abdullah al-Hussein. I pray that Allah grant us all the honor of visiting Abu Abdullah in this life and attaining his shafa'ah, his intercession, and that of his grandfather, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family in the hereafter. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين، سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، اللهم صل على محمد وآله. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ومولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء، يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا، وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما. God states in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the servants of the most compassionate are those who walk humbly upon the earth, and when the ignorant address them, they say peace. Amanna billah, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Let us begin by enlivening our hearts and minds and our virtual gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. There's an old Afghan story that tells us that there was once a king, a mighty king, who used to rule over his subjects in sort of a dictatorial, oppressive fashion. His subjects to him were pawns without faces. He would rule over them ruthlessly. without concern for their needs, without concern for them as human beings. And so the story tells us that one day this ruthless king, he goes out with some of his close advisors to go hunting. And as he is hunting, he notices there's a beautiful gazelle. And he wants to hunt this gazelle. So he begins to chase this gazelle. And the gazelle begins to run fast, run away from the king. The king does not stop. He continues to pursue this gazelle. The gazelle runs faster. The king chases after it faster until he ends up going in between the forest, in between the woods and out. For several hours, he continues to chase this gazelle until finally the gazelle is able to disappear. It is able to outrun the king. The king is tired. He spent several hours chasing this gazelle, but he turns around, he looks around, and he notices that he's all alone. There's no one around him. And he is unable to find his way back. This is new territory, unfamiliar territory for him. So he tries to find his way back. Suddenly, as he is crossing part of the desert, a huge sandstorm appears, and it continues for several days. And so the king is stuck in the middle of the sandstorm. He's tired, he's hungry, he's fatigued. After a few days, his clothes are torn. His face is unrecognizable because of how tired he is, how long he's gone without food. And so he finds himself hopeless. He ends up being found by some people who lived around in the desert. They find him, they take him in, they begin to take care of him, and they ask him, they tell him, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm your king." When they hear this, they begin to laugh, they scoff at him. "You are king?" And so they help him go back to the capital, to the city. He goes there, he approaches his palace, and he stands, the guards are standing guard, of course, at the entrance of the palace. And he tells them, he identifies himself. He says, "I'm your king, let me in." They too begin to scoff. "You are king?" They cannot recognize him. His face has become unrecognizable. So they do not allow him. They prohibit him from entering the palace. He stands there and he looks between the gates. And as he's looking, he notices that it seems like someone has substituted him, is sitting on his throne. And he's also dealing with people ruthlessly. He's yelling at his advisors. He's abusing those around him. So the king turns around and he begins to wander in the city. And slowly, people begin to help him. Some people around him, they see that he's hungry, they give him food. They give him clothing. He in turn finds others around him that are in need, and he begins to share his food with them and to slowly care for those who are in need. The story says that one day he finds a child who is in a burning building. He runs inside the house in the building and he pulls the child. He rescues the child to safety. And slowly he begins to realize the importance of others around him. And soon enough, as he learns this lesson of humility, once again, the story says that he is able to go back to the palace and he recognizes his place. He is once again admitted. He is recognized as the king. He is admitted in his palace. But this time when he enters the palace, he enters with a renewed understanding of his responsibility towards others, of this renewed sense of humility that he has achieved and acquired. Now, the moral of this story, of course, is the significance of humility. But essential feature, the story reminds us that an essential feature of humility is the recognition that others exist in the world. Now, all of us will agree with this truism that others exist in the world around us. And we find that especially in this age of the spread of pandemic with COVID-19, this has become a clearer recognition for us. You know, many of us are prohibited from gathering with family members, extended family members, with friends, with colleagues. We are no longer able to gather in social gatherings, physically come together in many cases. And so in this absence, now we yearn for the other. We yearn for the social other, the physical other, those around us. And so during this time of pandemic, we've really realized it's become clear to us that there are others and that we are dependent on one another. But despite this realization, despite the realization, the truism that we all recognize that others exist, many times we find ourselves not necessarily, or others, not necessarily living according to this truism. You know, from childhood, many of us are led to have this, carry this implicit belief that we are somehow special, more special than others around us. Sometimes we behave as though common laws, we are not subject to common laws like everyone else. You know, there are many examples that we can think of in our lives where one example, for instance, is what I like to call MST, Muslim Standard Time. This is something that many of us will recognize. Some people, they find that it's very much okay for them to arrive at a gathering or at a meeting or at an event at any time they please. They have no consideration of others' time. It's as though no one else exists, only they exist themselves. And so they arrive at any time that they choose to arrive. We find that sometimes people, for instance, we're out in public, we find, you're going to a shopping center or anywhere else. This is prevalent. Sometimes you'll find that someone has parked their car and taken up 2 spaces. They could have taken up 1 space, but they decided to take up 2 spaces, right? Without concern for others. Sometimes we find that, on public transportation or in our gatherings, that some people, they take up more space than themselves. They have a space for themselves and then a space for their bags and their items without consideration for others. We find now with the spread of this pandemic, unfortunately, in many different societies, in many places, we've seen this on television screens, we've heard about this in the news, where many people feel that the laws, the health laws and the guidelines, the official guidelines that various state officials have given us, the health guidelines, they do not apply to them. And thus you'll find that some people, for instance, they'll go out in public, they'll mingle with others without care or concern for themselves or others. They do not wear masks. They do not observe the social distancing regulations that are encouraged and that are mandatory in many of our societies. So we behave sometimes as though only we exist, as though we are the center of the universe and that others do not exist around us. Now, if you were to ask these people who engage in this behavior, if you were to ask them, do you think other people exist in the world? They'll probably look at you, bewildered and say, of course, absolutely, other people exist. There's 7 billion other people in the world. But sometimes we find that their actions and our actions, they do not accord to this belief that we have. Humility, dear friends, is the death of the secret conviction that many of us hold in our hearts. It's the realization that we are not at the center of the universe. We find that one of the prominent titles that sometimes comes up in the media and in our discussions is this of the most powerful person on earth. Forbes magazine, a popular magazine, business magazine, comes up with a list of the most powerful people on earth every year. If I recall correctly, the last time that I looked at this list, 4 of the most powerful people on earth, according to Forbes, were heads of state. In particular, number 1, China, number 2, Russia, number 3, the United States, and number 4, Germany, and then other business leaders. And so usually the head of state or the heads of state could be considered the most powerful people on earth. And some people, they truly think that these people are the most powerful. They have access to armies, they have access to resources, they have access to weapons. But think about this. What is the head of state in the context of the galaxies around us? How many galaxies is this universe made of? I read one time that the Milky Way, which is our own galaxy, the Milky Way, only the Milky Way itself is 100,000 light years in diameter. And this is a number, a figure that, you know, I don't think I myself cannot understand. What does it mean to be 100,000 light years in diameter? This is only our Milky Way. This is not the rest of the galaxies in the universe. So what does it mean to be the most powerful person on earth in the context of this galaxy? Thus, we find that the Quran constantly reminds us of the importance of maintaining humility. God says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا. Do not walk upon the earth exultantly. وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. You know, sometimes we find that people who are arrogant, who express pride, this is not just an expression through their speech or through the way that they look, but also through the way that they present themselves and the way that they carry themselves. Sometimes there's sort of this arrogant walk that, you know, we may notice, where someone kind of struts, you know, they might even kind of stomp their feet as they walk. They might walk with their chin up, raised high, you know, their chest sort of out proudly, sort of an arrogant, prideful walk and demeanor. The Quran says, do not walk on earth exultantly in pride, in arrogance. إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْض. No matter how hard you stomp on the ground, you will never pierce through the earth. Very beautiful analogy the Quran gives us. إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْض وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. No matter how high you raise your head and your chin, you will never reach the height of the mountain. The Quran reminds me, tells me, who do you think you are? Sometimes you express arrogance and pride, but remember who you are. Remember how small you are in the context of the rest of creation around you. And so to realize, dear friends, to realize and accept that we are not as important as we think we are, it's a very painful realization, very painful. But it's also very liberating, and it's a source of strength. It's precisely when we are able to realize, to accept, to understand our weaknesses that we become fully human. Just look at, again, our context, our time today with coronavirus, with COVID-19. COVID-19, this virus has made clear to the entire world just how weak we are as individuals and as society. Not just on an individual level, not just my physical body being weak, that a virus can come and attack me and to destroy me, but also when it comes to our social systems, our political systems, our economic systems of the entire world, we are shown how weak they can be in the face of this virus, in the face of illness, in the face of pandemic. So we realize how weak we are. And this is a sort of strength, brothers and sisters, when we realize our strengths and our weaknesses. And thus, one of the most important things that we can realize is to know our strengths and to know our weaknesses, to know our limits. There's a beautiful hadith that many of us have heard, we've probably memorized. It says, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah." The one who recognizes, who realizes, who knows oneself is better suited to know his or her Lord. What does that mean? When we know our strengths, when we know our limits and our weaknesses, those both that have been given to us by God, our strengths and our weaknesses, when we recognize those, when we realize those, then we are better suited, we are better positioned to recognize God and the magnificence of God. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah. Imagine someone goes around in the world, proceeds in the world, faces the world without knowing one's own strengths or weaknesses. One assumes or has misguided notions of one's self. One dreams of being admired by others for talents that one does not possess. If we were to imagine such a person, we could only shudder at their fate, right? Sort of like a child. Many of you are parents, you have young children. Sometimes you'll notice that if you take your child out, before, when we would take our children to the park or to the amusement park or out on long walks, even now, many of us, we exercise in our neighborhoods as a family. And so sometimes the child will express his or her desire to, ride their bike the whole time, or take, their scooter, or assume that he or she can walk for long distances. And they have a misguided notion of their strengths, their abilities. Now, as a parent, my child is going to get tired. My child is, after a while, they're going to get tired of riding their bike or their scooter, and they're going to come and they're going to hand it over and say, Baba, Mama, carry this for me, right? That they're going to get tired of walking after a while. But sometimes this is how we operate. We have a misguided notion of self. We expect people to admire us for talents that we do not even possess. And this is dangerous. I read once a really beautiful story about a young man who had just become a preacher, a religious preacher. And, he was being invited to various venues to give lectures and speeches, and he was charismatic, a good-looking young man. And he would dress very well. And so every time he would go up and he would speak, he would come back down, the congregation, they would commend him, they would admire him, they would remind him of how great his talk was. So one day he was about to go up to speak, and he had his mentor who was also sitting in the audience. This was his mentor's first time sitting and listening to him speak. And so the young man was full of pride. He was very, sort of encouraged with his performances. And so they called out his name, they introduced him. He got up and he began to strut proudly towards the pulpit. He went up with a big smile, with all of the pride that he could muster. And as he stood in front of the audience, suddenly he found himself paralyzed. He was not able to speak. He was not able to utter a word. And so he failed. And so he was very ashamed. He put his head down and shamefully walked down from the stage, from the pulpit, and back out of the venue. After this event, his mentor he approached him and he told him, listen, what happened to you? He said, I don't know, I froze. I looked at the audience and I completely forgot everything that I wanted to say and everything that I wanted to do, and I froze, and I'm so ashamed, I failed. His mentor, he turned to him, he smiled. He told him, dear son, let me tell you something. Let me tell you what you did wrong and how you can fix it. Had you gone up to the pulpit in the same manner that you came down from the pulpit, you would not have come down from the pulpit in the same manner that you went. And so here, you would have come down from the pulpit in the same manner that you went up. Meaning what? Meaning that had you gone up with humility, when you went to do what you needed to do, had you gone with humility, you would have come down with happiness, with pride, without being in a state of shame. And so it's a strength for us, dear friends, to realize our strength and our weaknesses. And thus, the essence of humility is to be honest with oneself and with others around us. And this is why our teachings, they focus on working towards acquiring humility, being humble in all of our life affairs. And they remind us of the importance of humility, not just in our spiritual growth, that for us to grow spiritually, we have to be humble. But the benefit is not just in our spiritual growth, but also the benefit is in our individual intellectual growth, in our social growth, in our growth in this life, in this world. We find many studies, for example, they tell us that one of the most important aspects of learning is that we approach learning with a humble attitude. We approach learning through being humble, and that humility is the best tool for learning. Why? Because it allows us, humility gives us the ability to admit our weaknesses, to admit our ignorance. There's a common misconception floating around that men will never ask for direction, even if they're lost. That no matter what happens to a man, no matter how lost he is, he will never ask for direction. He'll always try to figure things out himself. Now, whether this misconception is misguided or not is another issue. But perhaps if there are men who will never ask for direction, despite being lost, perhaps this is a reason or a source of this, a reason for this is that they're not willing to admit their ignorance. They're not willing to admit failure. But this doesn't help us learn. It keeps us lost. We're not guided. And so one of the best tools to learning is that we approach learning with humility, with humbleness, with an openness to learning. And this is why Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says beautifully in the hadith, he says, "At-tawadu'u thamaratul ilm." That humility is the fruit, it is the product of true knowledge. That knowledge should not lead us towards arrogance and pride, towards thinking of ourselves as better than others, as superior to others. And this, unfortunately, is a problem that many of us face. You know, those who learn, those who have devoted themselves to scholarship and to learning, sometimes some of us, we may feel the sense of superiority because I know more, I'm better than others. Because I have this degree or these degrees from this institution, I know better than others. And it causes us sometimes to express arrogance. But Imam Ali here, he reminds us that the true product and fruit of knowledge is humility. And those who are truly knowledgeable realize that no matter how much knowledge they develop, The more knowledge they develop, the more they realize how little they know. And this is what Imam Ali alayhi salam points us to. This very fact of life, of our nature as human beings. And we find that expressing humility also helps us in our relationships with others around us. Again, sometimes we may exclude the possibility of learning from others, of benefiting from others, right? I might think that because of my age, that there are those around me who I may not benefit from, right? Those who are younger than me, for instance, I'm not going to benefit from. As a parent, I might assume that I do not benefit or learn or grow from my children, or from my younger siblings, or from my younger colleagues, or those around me, those who may not have the prestige or the job or the place in society that I have. Sometimes we exclude the possibility of learning and benefiting from others. Humility helps in breaking that down, in opening the horizons, the possibility of benefiting from others, of learning from others around us. Oftentimes we assume that we can only learn from a scholar, we can only learn from an expert. But life teaches us that lessons abound all around us, that learning, knowledge does not just come from those who are scholars and those who are experts, but from those who are around us. I mean, look at the beautiful example of the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Imam Hussein and his companions were a very diverse group. It wasn't just, an army of young, strong men. There were men and there were women. There were young and there were old. Some of the traditions, they tell us that individuals such as Habib ibn Madahir, this great companion, was in his 70s. He was old. Some of the traditions, they tell us he was so old that his eyebrows had grown long, and so he had to wear a headband to keep his eyebrows from covering his eyes, sort of signifying or symbolizing his old age. We find that there are young men. We find the lessons that we learn from individuals such as Ali al-Akbar, who had an unwavering loyalty to the truth. Ali al-Akbar, who was one of the sons of Imam Hussein. Some traditions, they say he was 18. Other traditions put him in his late 20s. But yet we find this great young man who teaches us a lesson of loyalty to truth. The reports say that Imam Hussein, on his way to Karbala on his horse, he fell asleep for a moment, and then he woke up and he began to recite, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. His son Ali al-Akbar, he overheard his father. He told him, my dear father, you began to recite Inna lillah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. What's going on? So his father told him, my son, I fell asleep. And in this short moment that I fell asleep, I saw a dream symbolizing that death is coming near, that death is approaching us. So Ali al-Akbar, he turns to his father and he tells him, my father, أَوَلَسْنَا عَلَى الْحَقِّ, are we not on the path of truth? Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he tells him, of course, my son, we are on the path of truth. Ali al-Akbar, listen to this, his beautiful reply. He tells him, my father, if we are on the path of truth, then it makes no difference whether we go towards death or death comes towards us. Very beautiful. This unwavering loyalty to the truth. It makes no difference. This is a lesson we learned from a young man, Ali al-Akbar. We learned the beautiful lesson from an even younger individual, Al-Qasim, who was in, his teens, his early teens, according to some traditions, maybe 13 or 14 years old. Imam Hussein asks him, he tells him, oh Qasim, after Al-Qasim insists, he tells him, I want to go out and I want to sacrifice myself. I want to fight. Imam al-Hussein, he's heartbroken. This is his nephew, his only memory remaining memory of his brother Al-Imam Al-Hassan, but he asks him, he tells him, my dear Qasim, what do you think? What is your view of death? Al-Qasim, he tells him, as long as it is with you and on the path of truth, death is sweeter than honey. Allahu Akbar, very beautiful. This is a 13-year-old boy, a young man, who teaches us this lesson. Many others who were younger than him, they teach us the lesson of what it means to sacrifice. We find the lesson of the women who were there. This young woman who the traditions tell us was the wife of Wahab al-Kalbi, who was a convert from Christianity to Islam. He converted and he came along with Imam Hussein, with his wife and his mother. And he and his wife, some traditions say that it had only been 3 weeks that they had gotten married. She comes to him, rushing to him as he's on the battlefield, his wife, and she tells him, my dear husband, do not come back until you have sacrificed yourself. She's sacrificing her husband. She's sacrificing this relationship. He tells her, why? You were telling me before, you were discouraging me from going out, and now you're encouraging me. She tells him, don't blame me, Allah. I heard the cries of Abi Abdullah al-Hussein. I heard the cries of the women and the children. This broke my heart. And tradition says that after her husband was killed, she herself was also killed, and she sacrificed her own life as the first female martyr on the day of Ashura. And there are so many other lessons that we learn from this diverse group of companions, of family members, of participants of Imam Hussein. And so this humility allows us, dear friends, the possibility of learning from others, of benefiting ourselves and others around us. Thus, we find that the greatest individuals, the greatest of God's men and women who walked on the face of this planet, all of them were humble. All of them expressed humility in their lives. Imam Hussein alayhi salam also expressed humility. There are many reports, many traditions that tell us of various events in the life of Imam Hussein where he used to express humility before others. In one report, we are told that one day in the city of Medina, Imam Hussein, he is riding along on his horse, and he passes by in the street, he passes by a group of several young men who were very poor. And they were sitting on the ground on the dust around one another, and they had a few pieces of dry bread, and they were sharing this very humble meal. As Imam Hussein was approaching from the distance, they noticed that it was the Imam, and they called out to him, and they told him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, we request that you honor us with your presence. Come down and join us for a meal. And their meal was humble. It was dry bread. It wasn't like they had a fancy meal, a fancy spread of food. The report says Imam Hussein dismounted his horse immediately, and he proceeded towards them, and he sat with them, and he joined them in that meal, and then he thanked them. And then he told them, he said, my dear friends, I accepted with honor your invitation. So I request now that you accept my invitation. I invite you to come with me. The tradition says that he went home, he took them home, and he asked his wife Al-Rabab, the report says, he asked his wife Al-Rabab to collect all of the money that they had saved in their home, and he gave it all to these young men. This was the humility of Imam Hussein alayhi. He learned this humility from those around him. This is the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Fatima al-Zahra. Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was known as Abu Turab. Why? Because he would sleep on the dust. The dust would gather over him. Abu Turab, the epitome of humility. Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam, who was the epitome of humility. The report, the story tells us that Fatima, on her wedding night, she has her wedding dress. Of course, when we say wedding dress for Fatima, this is not a fancy wedding dress, but it's a dress that is suitable for her as she is getting married. The report says that at that moment, a woman in need comes and knocks on the door. She tells her, "You are the household of kindness and generosity." Allahu Akbar. You don't say no. You don't refuse others. I'm in need. I don't have a suitable attire, clothing to wear. Fatima Zahra alayhi salam, she goes and she gives her brand new dress. She gives it away. This is humility. This is understanding, recognizing that there are others around me, that it's not just me in the world. And so he learns from his father and his mother, and he learns from his grandfather Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, peace be upon him and his family, who is the father of humility. The Quran reminds us of the status of the Prophet. Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi. Praise and glory be to God who took his servant. And the Prophet was someone who was honored to consider himself to be the servant of God. This was an honor for him, a privilege to express humility before God and before others. So we should not be surprised at Imam Hussein. This is the grandson of Rasulullah. Husaynun minni wa ana min Hussein. The Prophet says, Hussein is from me, and I am from Hussein. They are inextricably linked, dear friend. And this is the core of Walaya. The core of Walaya is that the love and the respect and the honor that we show to the Ahlul Bayt is a reflection of the love and respect and honor and obedience that we show to the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his family. Husaynun minni wa ana min Hussein. They are inextricably linked. It's two-way. You know, we realize Husaynun minni, Hussein is from me, Hussein is my grandson. We recognize this. But what does it mean for the Prophet to say, wa ana min Hussein? I am from Hussein. Here he's establishing this unbreakable bond between the two. And so it comes as no surprise that Imam Hussein, who is the heir of the Prophet, in fact, Imam Hussein is the heir, the warith of all of the Prophets, all of the messengers. Al-Anbiya, warithul Anbiya is Imam Hussein. And we recite this in the ziyarah. I'd like to end, dear brothers and sisters, with sharing with you a very short poem in English. I wrote this poem several years ago in honor of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. The title of the poem is Hajar Runs Between Hills. Hajar runs between hills and suddenly stops when her baby is silenced by Zamzam's flow. Hajar runs between hills and suddenly stops when her baby is silenced by Zamzam's flow. Zainab stands on the hill shocked in great distress when her nephew is silenced by that arrow. Ibrahim is commanded to sacrifice his son Ismail in order to succeed. Hussein is destined to take Ismail's place. But before him, his family will proceed. Yaqub is then separated from Yusuf. He sheds so many tears until he can't see. Hussein watches his brave Ali charge forward. It's as if whose charging is God's appointee. Musa was called to meet with his Lord for days. scolded his brother Harun when he came back. Hussein called Abbas to quench the children's thirst. He then sees him fall and cries, "Brother, my back." Then comes Isa, whose humility was great. He would lay on the ground and sleep without stress. The day would come when Hussein would also lay, drenched completely in blood on the sand, headless. Ya Rasulullah, my dearest Muhammad, the loss of your child Qasim was hard to heal. My master, forgive me for saying this now, but Hussein's Qasim was struck as he would kneel. I don't know whether to cry for Fatima or whether to shed tears for al-Baneen. They sacrificed great men for the sake of God, so that today for us Islam can be seen. I don't know whether to cry for Fatima or whether to shed tears for al-Baneen. They sacrificed great men for the sake of God, so that today for us Islam can be seen. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un wa sayalamu alladhina zalamu أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقي، وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات, and for the souls of the believing men and women, those who have passed away, نهدي جميعا ثواب سورة الفاتحة مع الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين.
We will now move to the culmination of today's program. And as we did yesterday, we will finish with a ziyarah. Since it is Friday, we will be finishing with the ziyarah of the Imam of our time. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alayka ya hujjat Allahi fi ardih. Assalamu alayka ya ayn Allahi fi khalqih. Assalamu alayka ya nur Allah alladhi yahtadi bihi muhtadun wa yufarriju bihi ayn al-mu'minin. Assalamu alayka ayyuha al-muhadhib al-khaif. Assalamu alayka ayyuha al-wali al-nasih. Assalamu alayka ya safinat al-najat. Assalamu alayka ya ayn al-hayat. Assalamu alayka صلى الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك الطيبين الطاهرين. السلام عليك عجل الله لك ما وعدك من النصر والظهور الأمر. السلام عليك يا مولاي، أنا مولاك عارف بأولك وآخرك، وأتقرب إلى الله تعالى بك وبآل بيتك وانتظروا ظهورك وظهور الحق على يديك. وأسأل الله أن يصلي على محمد وآل محمد، وأن يجعلني من المنتظرين لك والتابعين والناصرين لك على أعدائك، والمستشهدين بين يديك في جملة أوليائك. يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان، صلوات الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك. هذا يوم الجمعة، وهو يومك المتوقع فيه ظهورك، والفرج فيه للمؤمنين على يديك، وقتل الكافرين بسيفك. وأنا يا مولاي فيه ضيفك وجارك، وأنت يا مولاي كريم من أولاد الكرام، ومأمور بالضيافة والإجارة. وأضعفني وجرني، صلوات الله عليك وعلى أهل بيتك الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Please join us again tomorrow at the same time, 6:30 London time, for the next Majlis in this series, where we will begin with Swazkhani from Lucknow, and then continue with the address of Sayyid Samir Ali. So inshallah, see you all tomorrow at the same